TS Underswap is a fan game that is brimming with an endless amount of possibilities and things to look forward to. But beyond some very general theories and connections, I yet to see many theories go over the broader game, especially when compared to the more official entries like Deltarune. With this video, I aim to articulate a very broad theory of mine that I've had for a while about the Ruthless route, and hopefully begin to propel further analysis of this game. And as you can see from the video title, this is a theory that I've called the Discontent Theory. Now of course, I have to preface that due to the fact this game has only 2 demos complete, this video is mostly based on my own speculation and interpretive analysis of this game, particularly with its meta-narrative. In other words, this will basically be my own diet TS Underswap Oblivion theory. But before we can dive into the theory itself, I think it's important to address what the main objectives of this theory actually are. The main objectives of this theory are to analyze the meta-themes that TS Underswap may be lining itself up to explore in the Ruthless route, and to present how Papyrus' character and Ruthless boss battle may help further explore these themes. The goal of this theory is not to predict every event that will happen in the Ruthless route, nor many of the specifics of how a future Ruthless Papyrus fight may go. With all that said though, let's finally delve into the Discontent Theory. One of the most prominent and recognized themes that Undertale explores on a meta level is completionism, particularly on the No Mercy route. With that route in Undertale, the meta-narrative focused on how far the player was willing to go in order to see the game's remaining content and to exhaust their options. Even if compared to the pacifist route, the narrative by conventional standards is very disappointing. With many established plotlines like Torio's conflict with keeping you in the ruins, and even more of this route's specific plotlines such as Asgore fighting you with the 6 souls being intentionally undercut. And from a gameplay standpoint, the No Mercy route is extremely tedious and lacking in challenge save for the 2 new bosses. TS Underswap, by contrast, uses its Ruthless route in order to offer the player a new compelling narrative centered on the monsters evacuating from you, along with the conflict of our protagonist who is getting addicted to love. And although the game still features that same grinding of encounters, it's made far less tedious for the fact that you have to constantly switch rooms and move throughout the entire area to grind enemies. That's all without mentioning how, unlike Undertale, which only had 2 challenging and unique bosses, TS Underswap's Ruthless route ensures that almost all of the mini-bosses and special encounters remain engaging gameplay-wise. Officially, it's even stated to be the game's pseudo-hard mode. Both mechanically and narratively, the player is provided with content that is far more consistently engaging than Undertale's No Mercy route. Of course, that is not a knock against Undertale's approach, but I think this contrast between Undertale and TS Underswap's respective evil routes could help provide us an idea about the direction TS Underswap is heading. To further discuss that contrast though, I think it's important to lay out how exactly Undertale explored those aforementioned themes of completionism, and how TS Underswap presents them differently. In Undertale, there were 2 sides that existed for the theme of completionism that were both explored in the No Mercy route. There was Flowey, who served as a general representation of your own reasoning for doing this route to begin with, which included both satisfying your curiosity and a self-imposed obligation to see it. And there was Kara, who represented your need for short-term progression like stats, along with your mindless consumption and completion of the world. In TS Underswap, I'd almost say the presentation of these 2 themes have been swapped. Undertale presented Kara as an underlying and somewhat subtle force throughout the game, and their character is portrayed in an enigmatic way, and for lack of a better term, they were presented in the most meta and abstract way compared to any other character in the game. TS Underswap portrays them in a notably different way, with their character being far more direct and explicit, even if there's still many vague elements surrounding their character. And whereas Undertale mostly presents this desire solely from the abstract meta perspective, with only fan interpretation and external letters giving much potential credence to a more personal motive behind it, TS Underswap has given Kara a far more evident narrative purpose behind their desire for power, with their need to get strong being recontextualized from their presumably traumatic memories on the surface, along with the mysterious force that's compelling Kara to proceed along the Ruthless route, who I'll be labeling as the entity for the rest of this video. As a side note, because I got at least a dozen comments arguing against me on my TS Underswap Kara analysis, but I casually mentioned the entity likely being the player. The entity's actual identity is not relevant to this video, and for this particular theory, what's more important is what they represent to the story, rather than their actual identity. I normally wouldn't try to kill off a topic like this prematurely, and this discussion obviously has its place, but I would really prefer to receive comments going over the theory and analysis itself, rather than having to engage once more in what's been a very tired debate for me. that tangent aside, based on the little we've seen of the entity thus far, they seem to represent something far more akin to Flowey from Undertale, with the have-to-see line they state for their motives in the Ruthless route having the same phrasing as to when Flowey describes why he ended up killing everyone in his monologue. Unlike Flowey though, whose character and motives are portrayed in a far more direct way, similarly to T.S. Underswap Kara, the entity is framed in a similar way to how Undertale portrayed Kara, with them presumably being this mysterious and more meta force that seems to be an underlying factor in the Ruthless route. This swap in presentation is even shown somewhat for the aforementioned mechanics and narrative, with the grinding and one-shot kills being less of a priority like they were in Undertale, and the narrative and the characters in that narrative getting more evident focus, which Undertale intentionally focused on far less. Now then, T.S. Underswap could leave this at that, and just swap the presentation of these themes. But honestly, I really doubt the game plans to just regurgitate Undertale's themes with a swap in their style. After all, T.S. Underswap is a fan game of Undertale, and any fan game of a property ideally has the goal of expanding on the original in some way. I especially believe this considering some developer statements we've seen about the focus behind T.S. Underswap. Papyrus, the project manager for T.S. Underswap, has said, quote, "Our focus is on expanding stuff in creative ways, as opposed to trying to one-up Undertale, rehashing everything, or trying to answer its questions." With T.S. Underswap's status as a fan game to Undertale, with it being something that we're playing after Undertale, I'd argue that it simply can't be the same. We're not playing T.S. Underswap's Ruthless route solely out of a sense of completionism while feeling detached to the experience, as was the case with Undertale, which represented this through Flowey's soulless completionism. I mean, we're stuck here playing a fan game of Undertale. We could never be playing it because we feel attached, but rather for the opposite reason. We're too attached. It's not just about exhausting our options, but rather to see the characters we love in a new circumstance, to see every detail about them. That's why we're playing a fan game like T.S. Underswap to begin with, and the Ruthless route is just a further exploration of this. In other words, it would be hitting people like me who attempt to analyze this fan game and Undertale itself to oblivion to comprehend all of the details behind these characters. On another note, I'm not quite sure if there's an exact term for this, but for the sake of convenience, I'll be referring to this as narrative completionism, which will be a term referring to the player's need to see every side of the narrative, along with the characters and their arcs. I think T.S. Underswap focusing on this idea of narrative completionism also helps to explain certain additions T.S. Underswap has made, such as this game's newly added trophies. The trophies in T.S. Underswap function as achievements like they would in any other game, but this detail feels fascinating when you consider how Undertale itself handled its achievements. When Undertale originally released, the game had no achievements whatsoever. And when Toby Fox was forced to add achievements for the console ports, he only added achievements for things like obtaining a certain amount of items, reaching certain areas that you'd reach no matter what route you took, and the Dog Shrine. There were no achievements added for any of the specific routes like Pacifist or No Mercy, and considering the game's ideas on completionism itself, that's honestly expected. T.S. Underswap, on the other hand, treats the trophies much like how any other game would, with achievements given for not just reaching the main areas like in Undertale, but also for doing certain routes like Ruthless and Compassion, along with seeking out the game's many secrets, particularly with the achievements like many of Coffin K's achievements that you can only gain for being a good or bad servant. The game is imploring you in this way to explore all of the intricacies of the game's characters and story. This approach to achievements is completely in contrast to Undertale, and although it could just be for the aesthetic, I can't help but feel that it adds to how this theme of narrative completionism is what underlies this fan game. Another addition in TS Underswap to note on this subject are the free save files that TS Underswap provides you, compared to the singular save file that Undertale gives the player. In Undertale, the diegetic in-universe reason is likely because each force with enough determination to save only has access to their own singular save file. Beyond that though, it also contributes to your actions having genuine consequences, since it makes it impossible to escape to another save file to avoid any repercussions from your actions. If there are multiple save files, it would make moments like the post-credit scene with Flowey hold almost no meaning. Now, for TS Underswap, there is a whole other debate to be had on if these free save files are to be diegetic like how Undertale's save file was. However, what I'd like to propose is that whether these save files are actually diegetic to TS Underswap's world or not, what they ultimately do incentivize is for the player to explore all of the major routes of the game. The free save files allow you to do the Compassion, Ruthless, and Neutral or Evacuation route, without having to lose your progress on the other save file. And naturally, it encourages you to complete these routes, which, as I said previously, is completely counter to how Undertale treated these routes. This could also simply have been a change made out of convenience like with the achievements, but just like with those achievements, this change enhances the potential theme of narrative completionism TS Underswap may be attempting to explore. Now admittedly, this next part is quite presumptuous, but assuming that this is what TS Underswap aims to deconstruct in its meta themes, then I can see no other character in this game embodying this except for the entity. In the Ruthless route, we find out that the entity's motives for doing this route are because they have to see. As I previously mentioned in this video, this directly parallels how Flowey describes having to see but would result from killing everyone. But despite that parallel phrasing, I feel inclined to believe that the context is different. Considering that Papyrus, after the entity states this, specifically asks what it has to see from hurting people, and if that makes it happy, I can definitely see this alluding to the entity's main desire. This broader idea of the entity representing the theme of narrative completionism may also be alluded to in other areas, such as the Crossbones battle. In Undertale, much of Sans' dialogue was centered on our unmatched determination to see through what we started, as he now famously stated during that fight, because you can, you have to. In TS Underswap, his dialogue has a similar focus, but there's also a stronger focus on how you need to know every side of his character. As he puts it, you're doing this just because you need to know. Throughout the fight, he's coy with how he plays with our expectations to see some tragic backstory for him, with how he gives us a backstory from his comics, and in subsequent fights, he'll even give you some extremely outlandish stories instead. Crossbones elaborates that there may be some element of truth in it, he intentionally keeps us in the dark. The entity embodying the theme of narrative completionism may also help to explain why the entity's presence is just as strongly felt in the Compassion route, which is in strong contrast to how Undertale's Kara, at least the meta side of their character, is almost entirely non-existent in any route besides the No Mercy route. In Undertale, by playing the Pacifist route, you treat the world as anything but a conventional RPG, and although Kara's meta presence will always technically be felt through how you acquire higher stats like gold, the Pacifist route is about firmly denying that this world is just an RPG. If you want me to explain this concept further in depth, I recommend watching this video that tackled this subject in the Undertale section. Shameless plug aside though, the entity appearing in pretty much every route in TS Underswap makes sense if thematically they are meant to represent narrative completionism. In the Compassion and Neutral routes, all of the entity's dialogue prioritizes progressing onwards and heading back to the surface. This could just be mimicking the entity's determination to proceed, but in a meta sense, their drive to keep going forward could represent our desire for narrative progression, particularly with the entity's seeds like the ones with Asgore. It's through the entity's will to proceed that we can see the rest of the game's narrative. I think there's also something to be said about how most of the entity's dialogue is optional, except for Asgore's home, but their dialogue is always escalating the conflict between it and Kara. It's their intervention that allows us to see new sides of our protagonists, with the most infamous example probably being how Kara yells at them to shut up in the Ruthless route. In a sense, the Compassion route is the test for the player to see how far they're willing to go in order to see all of the narrative, and the Ruthless route is the furthest extreme of this, where you kill everyone in order to see the hidden depths of all these characters. Now then, with the foundation of this analysis well established, I'd like to delve deeper into the meat of this theory, which lies in the Ruthless route. As I stated at the beginning of this video, one of the main objectives of this theory is to examine how Papyrus' character may be relevant to the themes of the Ruthless route, which is especially pressing considering that it's been all but confirmed that we will receive a Ruthless Papyrus fight in the future, both by how the narrative is setting him up for future development and through many developer statements. But what can we predict about this? Admittedly, so far there's only one major scene that is pertinent to theorizing Papyrus' future in the Ruthless route, and that's of course the final Starlight Isle scene on the bridge with Papyrus. If there's anything to note about this scene however, it's that the conflict in this scene is not derived from Kara and Papyrus like you'd expect, but rather is about the entity in Papyrus, which I find to be an extremely interesting choice, considering how Undertale also had a major conflict with two characters in an extremely similar position in its bad route, that being Kara and Sans. In the No Mercy route, Kara and Sans are designed to be nearly perfect foils for each other. As I previously discussed in this video, Kara and Undertale represented the underlying addictive nature of your short-term RPG stats increasing and achieving the absolute for said stats. In this regard, Sans serves as an extremely interesting foil to Kara, because he invalidates all of that. By the time you fight Sans in the game, you have access to the real knife and heart locket, which are items that have insanely busted stats. However, despite having these items are meaningless against Sans. The real knife's high attack means nothing against Sans, due to him dodging all of your attacks anyways, and the heart locket's high defense along with all of the high HP you've gotten have become far less useful due to Sans removing your invulnerability frames and applying karma damage to you. Sans invalidates all of the progression and stats you've earned over the course of the No Mercy route, and the foil between Kara and Sans feels particularly highlighted through how Kara is highly associated with the number 9, while Sans is strongly associated with the number 1, representing the maximum and minimum respectively. What adds this even more is that Sans isn't even a necessary boss for this route in order to reach LV20, or the Absolute as Kara would refer to it, because even though you gain it from Sans, you would have gained that extra LV from Asgore regardless, who is designed to be the final boss for this game from the start. His role as a roadblock that solely impedes your progress is also strongly shown for how his special attack is to literally never let you have your turn, which would permanently prevent you from progressing. Now, with how the game has seemingly swapped the presentation of its meta themes that Undertale had, along with how it could be setting up to expand on Undertale's themes and ideas, I believe that the entity of Papyrus may be foils in a similar vein to how Kara and Sans were. And as I've spent a majority of this video discussing, I believe that the entity will be a representation of our desire for narrative completion, of wanting to see all of the sides of the story and the characters due to how attached we are to them. To fill this role, Papyrus can't just simply be Sans 2.0, because Sans is on a challenge to the entity. Sans' fight in Undertale provides new characterization, mysteries, and details to ponder about thanks to his fight. Even in this very fan game, although he plays with your expectations narratively, he does provide you with a potential hint to his backstory, that if you dissected it, you can discern more details behind his character and past. And that doesn't even begin to mention his very likely chance of reappearing later on the Ruthless route. So then, the natural question of course is how could Papyrus possibly foil the entity? And the natural answer to that question is pretty simple: narrative disappointment. I mean, after all, Papyrus is the character that fans are going to be the most anticipated seeing in the future, with him likely being the final boss of the Ruthless route. This is strongly shown of how there are entire fan games dedicated to just exploring this before TS Underswap has even released anything for it. Even when looking solely within the context of TS Underswap's narrative, he's clearly being set up for character development centered around his belief in you and your capacity for good. He also has many lingering plotlines of course, like how Sans faked his death to Papyrus, which will very likely result in some messy fallout for the both of them once that's revealed. For many fans of TS Underswap, the Ruthless Papyrus battle is going to be a major deal to them, or perhaps even the thing they were most anticipated for. Admittedly, the idea of Papyrus' Ruthless fight ultimately ending with an unresolved character arc for what this narrative is setting up, and the player being left in discontentment, definitely sounds somewhat out of left field. I mean, isn't this the fan game that provides a new, compelling narrative on the Ruthless route? Perhaps what I'm suggesting is a bit out there, but I'd also argue that the seeds for the type of encounter I'm describing have already been planted, because Papyrus would not be so unique in this regard for narrative disappointment. For instance, Coffin K is easily TS Underswap's most popular original character, with his strong presence and amazing character development that he undergoes in the Compassion route. However, in the Ruthless route, he only makes one mandatory appearance that was kept extremely brief, and unlike how many expected an impactful boss from him, or even just a major character interaction, he's received extremely little so far, especially compared to how even Undertale handled its characters in the bad route like Papyrus. Now of course, many have predicted that Coffin K will make a future appearance in the Ruthless route, presuming that he'll come back for revenge for Harry and Larry, or something along those lines. Although frankly, I don't think that'll happen. Nothing in the game really hints that Coffin K will have any major significance later on, and some developer statements we've received seem to imply otherwise. And for the sake of this theory, presuming this is all we'll get from Coffin K highlights the point I want to make, which is that to some extent in the background of the narrative, we can see these clear instances of narrative disappointment. In the context of this theory, Coffin K would act somewhat as a precursor for how Papyrus' arc would ultimately conclude in this route, someone who makes the player feel discontent upon seeing their character arc. Now naturally, I have very little hard evidence for this theory, due to us only being around 2 fits through the game, but I do think going back to Undertale Papyrus with this theory in mind could provide us some new insight. In many ways, even if this point is frankly somewhat surface level, Papyrus is a very subversive character by a lot of conventional narrative standards, and sometimes he's even designed to be intentionally disappointing. His character in the No Mercy route is the most evident example of this. In this route, Papyrus undergoes a whole new character arc of learning to value the friends he already has, and ultimately tries to convince you to quit proceeding through the route. But if you continue on this route, he'll ultimately get mercilessly cut down in one shot if you proceed. And if you accept Papyrus's mercy in this instance, he even reveals that he is going to use his special attack, but regardless of what you do in the battle, he will never use it, or even try to fight. Even in the pacifist route, there's many things related to his character that can initially go against your expectations, such as how his state ultimately does not end with him falling in love with you as most players would likely assume, and rather him rejecting you. Even during his battle in the pacifist route, the special attack he constantly builds up throughout the fight ultimately ends up unused in favor of a gag. Of course, none of this is to knock Papyrus's character, because he's lovely, but there's a clear general trend in his character to at the very least, constantly subvert your expectations. Now, if you were observant while I was listing examples of Papyrus subverting your expectations, you may have noticed a general trend in many of those examples, that being the involvement of Papyrus's fabled special attack. And this may be the section where I really start to lose grip with reality, but I have some speculation about what Papyrus's special attack would thematically represent in the context of this theory. Before that though, let me loop back once again to how Undertale handled this special attack for someone else. In Undertale, Sans' special attack represented nothing, as he states. With that special attack, he was effectively able to completely halt your progress, by locking you in his turn forever. This special attack is arguably a nearly perfect foil to Kara, because this attack completely invalidates all of the grinding and progression that you've engaged in so far. It's the ultimate roadblock in which you are permanently stuck, or at least until you cheat to win that fight. With what this video has gone over though, the special attack that TS Underswap Papyrus may potentially use during his encounter could hold a completely new yet familiar meaning. To cut to the chase, I believe that Papyrus' special attack will also be nothing, but unlike Sans' special attack, I think it will literally be nothing. To elaborate on this point, in Undertale, Papyrus' special attack is something that's brought up and alluded to a few times throughout the game, but never once is it actually used. Imagine it like a locked treasure chest. A treasure chest which is rumored to hold the world's greatest riches, but has never once been seen before. This treasure chest is something that is not defined by what's actually in it, but rather by the expectation set on what treasures could be within. In this case, this is what Papyrus' special attack is, an idea defined solely through the player's expectations of it. What this theory aims to communicate, however, is that once you open the metaphorical treasure chest and witness Papyrus' special attack, you will be met with no treasures to speak of, or in this case, a hollow character arc that leaves the player with discontent. Papyrus' character is one that's had a large focus on subversions, as I stated previously, and so I feel like Papyrus' special attack could be an embodiment of all the player's betrayed narrative expectations. Before I wrap this theory up, I'd like to discuss an interesting thematic parallel that this theory would allow for between the entity and Undertale Kara's portrayal. Because although I've described Kara and Sans as nearly perfect foils for each other earlier in this video, and I obviously still believe in the sentiment, the truth behind that encounter is that if the player truly embodies Kara, and will not cease until they reach the absolute, then they will never lose that fight. The underlying addictive nature of growing more powerful and reaching the absolute of the game is something that's so strong for some people that no in-game character would ever be able to stop it, and Sans shows the futility of that. And similarly to Kara and Undertale, if the entity truly does represent what I theorize, then there would be no in-game character that can stop that. The ultimate desire that we, as players, have to experience every aspect of these characters and to pick apart all of the minor details surrounding them, that desire is unstoppable. I hope to not sound too conceited when I say this, but I feel that I have proven this sentiment. As I mentioned earlier in this analysis, Kafka's appearance in the Ruthless route has been generally seen as lackluster, or are expecting some major content from him in this route later. However, in my analysis of him, I ended up discovering how excellent his character really is in the Ruthless route, due to how in many ways it showed the logical extreme of the flaws that his character has. There are other more obvious examples of this sentiment echoing throughout the Ruthless route, such as how despite the way Crossbones toys with your expectations narratively, that fight's story is ultimately compelling due to the context of the evacuations which Crossbones is stalling for, along with the many lines of flavor text Kara has which gives more insight into the character. And of course, although Crossbones is pulling from his comics, there is the allure of an element of truth in them, particularly with things such as him traveling across universes. In a similar way, although the discontent theory does propose that Papyrus would initially be disappointing narratively, the players that would ultimately embody the entity the most would still be able to pick up new character details and content from Papyrus in the Ruthless route. With all that said, that's all for this video. I've had the general idea of this theory in my head for a while now, and it's felt amazing to articulate it all into a single video like this, even if it did get way longer than I thought it would. If you enjoyed these schizophrenic ramblings and meta-narrative analysis, then please consider liking and subscribing to help boost my content in the YouTube algorithm. And if you want similar TS Underswap analysis like this, I'd highly recommend my Coffin K analysis I mentioned earlier in this video. If you have any other interpretations of TS Underswap's meta-narrative, or just of the Ruthless route in general, then feel free to comment them down below. But other than that, take care.